Good morning, everybody. Is day 2 security better? No, worse. So I was here so early. It was nice. Yesterday was miserable. I'm gonna show Will here for a second, so you can say hello. Hopefully our audio is still working. This is Will Kirschmer. He's my co-presenter. Further away in Louisiana, so I may talk more just because there's going to be technical glitches with, shoddy Wi-Fi, shoddy guest Wi-Fi. But Will's here too, and Will is amazing. He's a senior developer at Figleaf. He works in Drupal. I'm a user experience designer and engagement manager, so we work together a lot, and this is something we've been working on with several of our Drupal sites that we want to just kind of share with you. So I'm pulling you off the screen now, Will. You can look casual. Great. It'll take me a second just to reorient this whole cursor situation. It's really weird to have to drag across like that. So, Figleaf software. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of us. So, sorry, we have an agenda. We're going to go through stuff. We're going to kind of do the telescope thing. We're going to talk broadly about understanding why this is important and usability in general. We're going to do some more specific stuff with Drupal, and we're going to talk about implementation. And then, of course, at the very end, we'd like to have an opportunity for you guys to ask questions. Depending on how quickly I talk, and I can talk too quickly, like raise your hand if I'm lightning speed and make no sense. But if I talk quickly enough, we can have more time for interaction at the end, and we can show you some stuff if you like. Figleaf Software, we're a digital agency. We've been in business for over 25 years here in DC at DuPont Circle. We have clients across the spectrum, so I'm going to show you a few of those. But briefly speaking, we do consulting in software design, website design. We do support for clients who are in a variety of different systems, and we also do training, which is what we're known for folks who've known us for these 25 years. So these are some of our partners. We work across a number of CMSs. We work in several different environments. Our marketing department cares very much that you guys know who we are by affiliation. So I'm going to briefly show you. These are a select group of our clients. These are our association clients. A lot of names you guys are going to recognize. Education, commercial clients, and of course government clients. A lot of what we're going to show today comes from a system we just launched yesterday for the Alaska Centers. It's probably not going to be completely quiet, but that's what it is because you're going to see a lot of taxonomy around Alaska. But you can go see this stuff in action, the front part of the site anyway. You won't be able to see the back end after this meeting today if you like. So the core problem here, when we design sites, we spend all of our time around usability and a lot of our time technically making the front end work, right? So this drives the folks who end up going back into the back end to maintain all that content that's getting served up a little crazy because it can be really chaotic to try and use the system. Custom implementations in particular. So if you're using something out of the box, sometimes it's fine, but most of the time people need training, people need documentation, they need all this other stuff, and nobody's got the time for that. So what we want to do is try to figure out how to do this better. And the first thing to do, as in any user-centered design process, is to know a little bit about who you're working with. I'm not sure how many of you guys here are designers. We could do a quick survey. Who's in the design end? So we got like a third designers. And who here is stuck in one of these systems and trying to figure out how to get people to fix it? We got a couple editors in the room. And developers. So we've got about 50% developers and then some folks who didn't fall into any of those categories will. So key things, right? Like when we're working, the roughly 2/3 of us in this room who do the technology and the design, we've got usually a couple different monitors up. We've got these mammoth displays. For us, it's really easy to move between different screens, to have multiple tabs open, to reference different systems. This is not the case for people who are using the system. They've usually got one chunky old monitor, whatever the standard is, right? So it makes it a lot harder to move between multiple interfaces. So we can't expect people to go grab something from here and put it there. We've got to make sure that it all works neatly in this one display space. Long forms are harder too. There's no specific reason to mention Drupal 8, but we do have folks, of course, in Drupal 8 who are going to be using mobile devices for the purpose of editing. So that means you've got a really, really, really small display and you really can't go cross tab. So you've got to make sure your interface works in one screen, in one tab. When you've got this smaller screen space, you can easily lose context, you can lose groupings, in addition to making it difficult to reference between screens. Referencing within a screen is hard. It makes it also, when you can't see different things, you can't compare them. So you can't say, oh, that image field over here, that's the one that means this, and this one over here means that. It makes it really hard to figure out which thing is which if we make people scroll around and try to figure that out. Also, your users, especially, and we're at Drupal GovCon, here we are with an employer who very much likes to limit the technology available to us. So people can't upgrade to get the features you want them to get. They can't switch browsers. They can't change their platform. So you need to make sure, from a base perspective, that this all works and whatever is going to be granted to them. So you can ask what that is and you can test in that. It's kind of a basic thing to do, but we need to do that. Another big deal, right, is that you're going to have people who, like us, maybe they've got a core web team over there with, experts who are going to be doing all the publishing regularly, but maybe they also have to release some of this to their media department and communications, right? And they're not necessarily going to be as comfortable in working with the CMS as your expert users. You can't design for the expert users and expect everybody else to come up to speed. It doesn't work that way. You've got to design for those early base users. You've got to make sure that somebody who is not familiar with technology, who's not familiar with content management systems and their logic, understands how to use what's being presented to them, right? Believe it or not, all those advanced users are going to appreciate this too. Nobody wants to reference the technical manual. Nobody wants to do that. Also, there's a lot of variation exposure. So those folks who are in your core web team, they're doing this all the time, right? But the folks who are not, they're coming in, they're hitting it once every 2-3 weeks as they need. That's a really tough curve. If this is something you do every 2 to 3 weeks, the chances of you remembering very clearly how to do it and all the intricacies of all the relationships is much lower. So it's much better to build in familiarity, predictability, stability. So another key point is, again, we can kind of infer this a little bit, but most people don't actually spend all day. Even the folks who are on your core web team, your editors in particular, they're going to spend a lot more time researching and writing outside of the system than they do in the system. So again, support them as well. Most people are going to be rushed. They're going to be interrupted. They're going to be very disinterested in referencing the beautiful style guide and manual you put together for them. So anything you can do to make it easier in the system is good. So how do you do this? So the UX folks in the room are going to kind of shrug for this next 2 slides. I apologize. You want to make sure you're using simple interfaces. So anything that's kind of cutting edge or unusual in terms of data entry is going to be a risk, right? You want to make sure people are doing something they do all the time. Simple text fields, drop-down lists, maybe not a complete at the sort of edgiest, right? It's got to be something people can use without having to guess how to use it. You want to make sure they don't have to know how to code. So build your styles into your editor. Do things, anything you can to sort of support people's ability to use the system without having to reference documentation. Provide really good instructions. I'll give some examples in a second of the variation between an instruction and a good instruction. And predictable workflows. We want to make sure people know what they need to do first. If there's some dependency that's required before they go and do something else, make sure they know they need to go do that before they start the process, so that they don't get halfway through or they're missing a required field and they can't save. Make the system flexible enough so that your advanced users don't go crazy too. So you can make it so that your basic, rare users, people who don't have a lot of expertise, can use the system, but still not lock it down so much that an advanced user can't go hop it around the system and get all their pieces tied together the way they want to do. So make sure that it's still flexible in the end for those folks as well. And finally, follow the basic usability principles for your CMS editors. And so I've got a couple notes that are broad, and then we'll talk a little bit about Drupal specifically. So the first thing is you want to name things in a way that makes sense to your users. Now there's a few different places you've got to keep in mind here. We're sometimes better at some of these than others in our systems. We pay a lot more attention to fields and these other things. But your content types, these matter. If you name it something obscure or something that means something to your team but not your client, that's not going to work. You've got to use their language and reflecting back what they're going to have to do. The fields on individual content types or other data entries matter as well. Make sure that you're using the same language from one place to another and that you're using predictable words. Drop lists, this is sort of a pain point for us. This is an unfortunate actual situation right now that we're attempting to fix. So we've got this drop list with all of these lovely back-end names and in parentheses the pretty name. It would be much better to arrange this so that we've got the pretty name, so you don't have to try to guess where to go in this list. You want to use, again, the simplest UI widgets for the content at hand. This is not just about the simplest widget, but one that matches your content. So this is a list of over 110 different items as in a taxonomy. 110 items as a checkbox. It's unworkable, right? That's endless scrolling, right? And at least in this case, they're alphabetized, but sometimes they're not. Drop list, also a problem, because that's for usability purposes untenable. So in this particular case, because this is a known list of items, it's a series of parks. It's not gonna change. Autocomplete works really well. You could also use a list box with multi-select. Here's another situation, right? If you've got a yes/no toggle, you've only got a limited set of options, and one is right and not the other. Use radio buttons, and make sure that it can be cleared. Clear box itself wouldn't work in this situation because of the particular UI method, and so we've got an unknown, so you can kind of back it out if you selected the wrong thing. And setting good defaults. The default is we don't know if the pets are allowed, and so let somebody opt into changing that later. Error messaging. We want to make sure error messages are easy to understand and helpful. I don't have illustrations of this. If a form is going to fail, you want to say why it's failed. If there's a particular aspect to the data entry that is the typical issue, or if you can sense what it is, provide that support with the error messaging. You want to make sure you're ordering your fields logically. So this comes to that issue with grouping, right? If you can't compare where things are at, and if you can't predict what's going to happen next, it's more difficult to enter your data. So as a broad stroke, this is a little wireframe of how you might group these fields. First thing is you want to have your really obvious necessary stuff for everything. Like it's something that somebody expects to enter first. So title should always be first. Sounds obvious, but isn't to everybody. So everybody on the team should know you're putting your title for the page first. Then something is, longer fields like your body would come after that. But all of your required things are grouped up at the top. Put together fields that might be confused or that might need to be compared, such as images, so that people can understand which particular instance they're looking at. And then group optional fields down towards the bottom of the page. Here we've got a grouping around taxonomies for the same reason, so people understand the variations between the taxonomies and how they're going to be used. And then rarely used stuff. So we've got in this particular system a really ugly thing I'll show you in a second, but if it's necessary for, I posted a page that makes no sense to ever feature. My privacy policy should not show up on the front page. It doesn't matter if it matches any keyword that you're searching on. So then we have a flag for that, for turning that off. And that flag should be down at the bottom because that's used on like 7 pages in the site. It makes no sense to put it higher up. Instructions are critical. So in Drupal, instructions by default will show up in these rather unfortunate things. I'm going to step away for a second. My mouse is over here. This is an instruction for this field. The valid instructions showing up on the far right side of the screen. And I squished this a little bit to make it easier to get into the screen on this presentation. So that's not ideal. That's really sub-ideal. It's better to have it than not have it, but everybody who's going to ever upload a file here is going to say what size is that image supposed to be, and they're never going to notice that instruction over there. So the way of mitigating this is to put a box around it. You create a grouping, a faux grouping with just this thing in it, and you provide your detailed text instructions here. This, by the way, I pulled this out separately from the image instruction. Everybody knows what image instructions should have, right? Your dimensions, file size, and format. Taxonomy instructions are often lacking. We know what taxonomy and tags are in this industry. Other people don't, and so they make really big mistakes with them. They skip them, they over-tag, thinking if I even mentioned the word in the page, it should come up, or they under-tag. So if you don't tell them how to do it and what the purpose is of the taxonomy, you're not going to get good results. And most of our sites that we're building, particularly for very large sites like in the government, are very taxonomy reliant. So you've got to tell people how the taxonomy is being used here and what exceptions there might be. Saving in predictable ways. There's a little less control over this than we might like. I would love, personally, if there was an autosave feature so that when somebody comes and interrupts my editor, and they walk away, and then their computer restarts to apply important updates, they didn't lose everything. There's some stuff out there to kind of that tries to make that work. I can't recommend any of it yet. We'd love if somebody brilliant in this room would create that. A more critical piece, right, that I personally hate whenever I'm building a menu is UIs that escape if you swipe by accident. Like you're swiping, you're dragging, dropping stuff, you've got the thing, it's been 7 minutes of work with all kinds of complex thinking, and then you accidentally swipe too far and it just escapes and you're done. You have to redo the whole darn thing. That's bad. Let's avoid it. Let's build that same kind of protection in there. Are you sure you want to leave? Keep them on the same page to complete a task. You don't want to lock them in. You want to provide support, rather. So if you have to have an image to make this piece of content something you can save, then provide the ability to upload the image on the page, not just a selector, right? Or conversely, provide the selector so that people can get to the thing they already uploaded. Taxonomy terms. They should be, unless you've got a rigid and locked taxonomy, make it, if somebody can add the terms, let them add that there in line. If you've got a related content type, authors are a frequent example, allow somebody to build that without leaving this current sequence, or at least create a stud file that they can return to. So wherever someone is going to point to a page or an asset, I indicated this a second ago, or in the course of content entry, let them do it in multiple ways. So let them enter the URL, give them a picker field. So especially if it's something on the site, an image, a document, another page, a picker tool is going to save most people because they're not going to understand how properly to build a URL. Particularly if you've got folks who are working in a dev environment and they're copying the URL from that page to this one, and they don't know how to make it a relative URL, you're going to have a problem. So make sure that a picker is available. Asset libraries, documents and photos and multimedia, this should be easy to browse. It means you need to set up a structure, make it available, and then set up good defaults so that if I'm currently in the process of uploading a descriptive photo, as the example here, it goes into the descriptive photo library. And if I'm picking a descriptive photo, it goes to that folder first instead of dumping me someplace else and making me figure it out. The upload process is usually more of an issue than the selection process. And then finally, we're almost through this stuff. It's going to drive UX folks nuts here. Support 508 compliance. So if you're uploading an image, require an alt tag. This could be this can be during the upload of the image, or in which case it can hopefully be saved with the image and reused. Some CMSs allow that. I haven't seen that much with Drupal. But if you can require it at least on the page before it's saved, then that will support that use case. And of course, check that it's not a space or something lame, image. Summaries and headers for tables. This is often overlooked. If you can require those, I'm not positive how to support this specific use case because I'm going to ask you to speak if you have any. Oh, you're frozen. Well, can you hear me all right? How can you support that?
That is on two of my to-dos right now. Is the opportunities for embedding better 508 and 508 compliance, both from table headers and from table graphical, i.e. div tables. Both of those are items that I should probably do in the blog posts.
Because of course the challenge
Look
for
out
tables.
this month.
The challenge for tables is because they're in the middle of your WYSIWYG editor, so you don't have the same opportunity to make a requirement because you have to sense that it's there and then make the requirement. But this is something we'd like to be able to make possible. People overuse tables. Not only
You can definitely shoehorn it in jQuery and
not only will people overuse tables when they don't need them, but they'll also forget these headers. And so if you ask them to make the summary of what's on this table and you ask them to make the headers, this both reinforces the accessibility support and it makes the person ask the question, do I really need a table for this? So, and transcripts and equivalents for multimedia. So if somebody's uploading a slideshow, inserting a slideshow or uploading a video, you can require a text field separate that will say if this exists, then show me my alt text. There we go. So the next piece is consistency and predictability. So here we've got some pieces that are unique to Drupal. Well, somewhat. To make content entry as simple as possible, you want to make sure that when somebody moves between one content experience and another content experience, they're having some sort of predictable and consistent experience themselves. So field names should be the same from content entry to content entry. Instructions should be either the same or in the same place if they're custom and unique to a particular entry from piece to piece. Field order should be predictable. This goes to that sort of wireframe I showed you of how to maybe organize these things. And when it's not the same, there should be a good reason. And then your data entry controls should be the same between content items. So a few examples. Here the field names are heading, thumbnail, and banner. But in this version, we've got title, descriptive photo, primary image. The only difference between these two pages is one's got a left rail. They're otherwise identical. This kind of discrepancy is really confusing. So bringing these two things into line makes a big difference for the people who are doing the editing. These instructions here, again, are important because people lose their style guides and they're not visible in this particular UI. You can build this kind of consistency in, these similar names between fields from the beginning of the project, or you can do an end of project cleanup, which we'll talk about both approaches in a moment. The usability of instructions are important. So here's a taxonomy list, and of course somebody's looking at this thing, okay, what am I supposed to do here? How do I properly tag this content? And so here's the first set of instructions. This taxonomy is being called an option value, and of course the natural question is, what the heck is an option value? It's being used to feed panes. Like, nobody outside of this room could interpret that into something, right? It's meaningful, that may be placed on a page. It sounds very, very optional, doesn't it? And it sounds like you're not really sure what to do with it. So a better set of instructions is something like this. Taxonomy, they've heard us all talk with them about what their taxonomy should be. They might be scared of it and still wonder what it is, but they know what the word means. And then we say what it is. Taxonomy is what makes related items, FAQs, and safety tips show up. Oh, I need to do this. Taxonomy is also used to filter lists. For anything that shows up in a mega menu, please make only one selection. Otherwise, they can have multiple selections. And so we can tell them all the details about why you only make one selection, but we've gotten to the point here at least, and so we've provided some support to help them make this work. So in this particular situation, we've got a thing that says automatically list things to do. So they're still looking at taxonomy, but we're not calling it taxonomy because that's not what's happening here. Not from a functional perspective, not from their perspective. In this particular situation, we're creating these itineraries, and we're describing the pieces of the itinerary, each of the different trips. If you want to show these things automatically, then you select from taxonomy. Otherwise, you go to this other place and you just select the things. So they need to know that here, the taxonomy is not just making stuff show up in the sidebar, but if they don't fill this out, their page is going to have no content other than that little paragraph they put at the top. So having the different instructions in the situation is important. Most of the time you want them to be the same, but if there's a different use case that's critical, point it out. Field order. So here we have, again, we're going to show the two different pages that are parallel set from the left sidebar. We're starting with title, these two photographs, the body, and then this exclude field that I told you is a little bit wonky. Over here, starting with descriptive photo. And so if you were starting to enter this, you'd ask, what happened to the title? That's supposed to be at the top. You'd be wondering, which image is this and where do I put the other one? These fields are all scrambled across the page. So in this particular case, we had to straighten those out after the fact, which caused a whole bunch of fun issues that we'll describe in a bit. So there's exceptions. There are exceptions. These are all taxonomies. This is that page a second ago where I showed you the special instructions on the automatically list things to do. These are pulled out separately on purpose. They're in a different order from usual because they're being used to drive the page function differently. So those are required in order to make this content type work. If you don't put them at the top separately and make them required, people are going to forget which ones are required for entering this content. They're going to get paranoid about it. You don't want to suddenly require something and not here and not there and not really call that out. So offset it. These are optional depending upon how the content should display. Again, if it's being driven by taxonomy, I want to find all I want to create an itinerary of all the different places I could go skiing in Alaska. Then I need to go down here and select skiing, and it's going to pull all of my trip ideas that have skiing involved. Not to do. Or out into the things to do panel. Otherwise, I can manually select them. So data entry. Between multiple instances of the same data entry field, you should have a similar format. So here we have a descriptive photo that allows me to choose a file but not upload it, or browse for it. So making sure that every place I've got that file, that particular UI, I've got the same options for entry is important. Otherwise, I get here and I'm kind of stumped about why I can't actually browse for a file. Is this different? What's going on? The parks and lands nodes over here, this is checkboxes, again, 110 of them, really very miserable. What we have everywhere else is these autocomplete fields, and so we need to bring those two into alignment. The biggest curse, I think everybody in the room who's opened Drupal probably knows, is URL entry, right? So Drupal makes this particularly challenging for us because fundamentally, everybody's entering their URL path to create a custom URL path. If you put a slash before your relative, who knows why, there's probably some really great reason why. If you put a slash before your alias, your page is not findable. It doesn't exist in Drupal. There's no way you can resurrect it. You've got to go into the back end, find the thing, come back in here and get rid of that slash in order for it to work. So they train you in a really brutal way to never put that first slash in there, right? So if you're a front-end editor, and this is the only time you ever create relative paths, and then you go to a field like this, it says, hey, give me your link, and there's a slash there, you're probably sitting there backing the thing out over and over again, right? And it shows up and you're thinking, that's going to break, I got to get rid of that. Link it is wonderful because it lets you search for the content that it puts in your node. But this is a very different means for entering a URL. This is a location finder thing. It's like a map tool. So if I put in my address, it's going to actually create a geolocation and it'll give directions. It's really very lovely. This www address over here, despite the fact that the near illustration over to the left, www address, does not include an HTTP prefix, requires that you have a prefix in there or it fails. This one doesn't. Same looking UI, right? But if I put www.google.com in there and save my page, it's gonna insert HTTP beforehand. Now, granted, you can't always assume that it's not a secure site, but providing some kind of defaults wise, right? So very different experiences in entering all these URLs. And then you've got the plain old link, that comes from the say CK editor, where it requires me to select a protocol. If I want to put in a relative link, I can, but other does not tell me that that's what I can do. So all these things, if you're editing and you're bouncing among these 5 different UIs, and then you come to this wonderful custom-built UI here, you're just thinking, how the hell, what do I do here? How does this particular instance work? There's no way to, you can provide some tech support, but really the better thing to do is to limit the variation that's happening here as much as you can. You don't always have control over these UIs, particularly if you're using, some things are deeply embedded in Drupal, like our URL path settings here. And some things come with these plugins, like this events plugin and this locations plugin. So you get limited control over it. But if you can isolate these exceptions, the need to use these exceptions to advanced users who are maybe infrequent users, who are maybe going to get the hang of it a bit more frequently by the frequent use, you can at least save some pain for many of the users of the system. Orphan fields are a problem. So here's an exclude checklist. This I'm going to walk away again originally. Yeah, there's that little arrow. You're scrolling down a really long page. That little checkbox just disappears. It's like a chameleon. You don't see it. And what the heck does exclude from thematic content lists mean? I wrote that text, by the way. I realized pretty quickly when I saw in that context we had a problem. So what we did was we offset this with a field group and then said what in the world it did. So when you select it, this page doesn't appear in the thematic and topical pages. That at least makes more sense because it's a content type. The last major problem we're going to talk about is content structures. So your editors, again, they're not using these things all the time. So having lots of different structures for the content can be really confusing. You have your basic content types, right? Most of us are familiar with these, even if all we do is edit. This is what most of what we do goes into. Then there's entity, collections, and fieldable panel panes. So if you've got a slider on your site, if you've got any sort of repetitive grouping of information, you want to be able to create this sort of group of fields, and then every time you create an instance, you've got the same group of fields that you're filling out. Then there's field collections. So if you've got something you really don't want being touched on a regular basis, you don't want, there's a great description of this. Well, description of it will come back up again in a second. If you've got something that's reasonably not going to be touched frequently, that's critical to the system function, you don't want it to be broken, you throw it in the field collection. Taxonomies, which are a ton more flexible, but can be leveraged for some powerful content creation as well. And then panelizer in place and pane placements. So you often find these on home pages, but you sometimes find them on pages where somebody's trying to create something that looks a bit fancier for their department or their landing page, right? And then there's paragraphs. This is something I have less familiarity with. The description is new, hip, on-screen page composition. But each of these things requires you to enter the experience of editing your content differently, to locate where you're going to find it in your admin panel differently. And then the methods for saving and referencing your content are very different, as you can see. So that matters, right? If you're trying to remember, when I come to this page, what do? It's a big deal. So when the methods of entry change for this part of the site from that part of the site, and I'm somebody who has to do both, and I don't do either of them very frequently, I'm likely to get confused. Do I have to go up to that menu for content and then pull down my content type, or am I going into structures and then choosing something really far down in a menu that tiers out 4 ways? That's going to be really frustrating. But the problem is in development, because the structural needs of the site, we use a bunch of these different things. Also, developers have different preferences. So to the degree you can, we want to try and minimize the variations between these things. So I believe I have an illustrate. Yep. Mitigation. Nope. All right, well, so I think that comes back in more detail in a second. But if you're deleting and uploading large data sets and you don't want tens of thousands of data changes running through your node table, then you might need those field collections and that taxonomy, and so it matters. And so having that discussion up front and figuring out how you can limit the need to access those particular exceptions to the content is helpful. The other piece is getting all of your developers to the table at the beginning to talk about what the approach to content should be. What's the default? Where do there need to be exceptions? And how can we mitigate them? So we want to, when we're choosing a strategy towards the content, the things to keep in mind are limiting the need to exit your workflow and come back to it. So if I use this approach, and that's going to mean that I have to be popping up 3 different windows in order to finish my content entry process, we know that that's not desirable for your average user. Keeping your content entry predictable from place to place, as we talked about. Choosing a primary method and isolating your exceptions is helpful. There can be exceptions. There are going to have to be exceptions every now and again. You're not going to get a slider on your homepage without some variation to the standards for entering content. But if you can make sure that the only people who need to edit that are, again, your advanced users or a core group of people who are going to understand that exception, that helps. So how do you plan this out? I'm gonna say, because I'm in a room full of developers and I don't want to be lynched, I did not write a couple of these bullet points here. So you want to make sure developers are paying attention during planning sessions, during discovery sessions. If you can't provide context behind why things are being built a certain way and who's going to use it, it's a lot harder for everybody who's involved in the building process to understand all the pieces at play, right? So developers try not to multitask during discovery. So a lot of the times when you're going into discovery session, it's because you're onboarding to a project to something else, kind of calms down. So you're trying to finish getting that site launched, or you're going through QA and mitigating bugs in that process. And that's where your head is. Your head is deeply involved in the closing of that project, and not necessarily in understanding all the complexities of this particular new project. And you're thinking, hey, my product owner is going to gather all that stuff and write it down for me. But if not everybody is listening during that process, a lot more can fall apart. So having everybody's attention is helpful. But at the same time, if you're in the role of being a product owner or project manager, if you can protect your developers' time, they're going to trust you a lot more that they should pay attention now. So make sure that you're not overdoing it on asking them to pay attention to too many different things, and let them focus on the core problems. So what you want is for the developers to come out of these discovery meetings and be able to have initial scrums that plan the structures of your content, that plan how these things are going to be related, how the system's going to be working. Not that they're thinking, now I just got to sit and wait till the design comes around, right? So you want to discuss together in this content session that I'm talking about all the developers having, what content structures there need to be, what field collections there need to be. And you guys want to come to a shared understanding of vocabulary. So what are we going to call these things in a way that we all understand what they are and we're calling them the same thing, and our client understands what they are, right? Use the language the client is using to describe these things. If you're going to group things, likewise come up with shared group names. Instructions are tricky. Instructions, I feel like usually could use a content author or a UX person to kind of review and rewrite them, because they're outside of the technical language around the system. So it's easier, not always perfect, but easier for somebody who's doing UX or who's doing editing to look at something and say, those instructions don't make sense, let me rewrite them. I think it makes a lot of sense for instructions in particular for you to get a second opinion. User stories can be a source for that. So if you're, at least for a draft, right? So if you're looking at a user story that says, as a content author, I need to be able to create a location that refers to a URL for my, end site, then you can say this section is where you create da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You can use those, and you can pull out big bits and pieces to help illustrate the piece for the rule for each field. In this process, you can also create those standards for ordering your fields. So I showed a possible draft of how those things should be organized. I think it's a good general principle, but there can be exceptions. So you guys should talk about when there need to be exceptions, because there's issues like the taxonomy has an entirely different role in this particular content. And you can create your own sort of shared team language for how these fields are going to appear, in what order, and so forth. The idea is to have this written down. It is not to create a Bible, right? The idea is if you've got a developer rolling off of this project and somebody else coming in, or if you've got QA coming in, you've got a logic that you can refer to. Everybody has a sense of what's going on with the names, with the structures, with the organizations, with the approach to content, and you guys can all share that in an easy, lightweight way. You don't want anybody to have to be reading this for 2 days, right? Drawings are fine. So pair programming during development can help a lot with this. Now, lots of people don't have a lot of budget or time to be doing pair programming, but if you can have 1 or 2 days fairly early in the project where you sit down and you compare how you guys are doing, did we understand the same thing from that working session, that helps a great deal. And then again, particularly as you're kind of coming about midway through the project, you've got something you can show that does certain things. Pair programming with your UX staff helps as well. That's where you can be looking at those instructions, making sure that the exceptions are managed in a way that's understandable to somebody who's not deep in how the system works. And then QAing for consistency. So if you provide your QA staff with the instruction to look not just at making sure the system functions and displays well in the back end, but that it makes sense for entry as well. And finally, what this comes out of is basically a post-mortem of how the project went. What can we be doing better next time? We had this plan, but it didn't work, and we had to retool. Why was that, and how can we make that not happen with the next project? So the best way to avoid headaches at the end is to plan early, but as you can tell, that's not what we did with this particular project. So if things fall apart along the way, or if you just, like you're in a project now and you want to go back and apply this, you can. You can still go through and sort and name your fields. You can add your instructions. But it's more risky because, of course, you've got multiple code sets now as people are working on their locals, pulling them up to a dev machine. Things can revert. So you might have to do it a number of times, and you might get really annoyed at trying to figure out where it didn't revert and trying to figure out who's still working on that thing you told them to freeze. So developer platforms can get out of sync. Again, multiple feature reverts can be issued at multiple times. So that can mess up what's going on in prod. There can be a lot of task duplication since things are overwritten and you have to go back and do this. And of course, this is happening not just for the folks applying these fixes, but folks who are doing active development on other features as well. So, tips of the trade. Standardize your local platforms. Make sure that everybody is moving local to dev to stage to prod. Impose code freezes and data sync days. So we're going to freeze the code, we're going to make these updates, we're going to upload it, and I want everybody now to pull down their system fresh, right? Make sure everybody's working from a fresh copy. Monitor your pull requests. So if things are coming from different sources and they conflict, have a conversation, and communicate reverts and versioning to the team actively. So, as we went through these last minute changes, we had a few specific things that we encountered that were really frustrating, so we're calling them out here. There's probably many more. When you nest fields, all of a sudden JavaScript starts to kind of choke. So your WYSIWYG and your file fields start to not display as they should. So the tip that Will is offering here is format your WYSIWYG and file fields for editors very early. That way there's less issues with QA later on. 5 WYSIWYG fields might work really great on your machine, but not so great on a really basic machine. So they really need to be tested in multiple environments. Events, we had a situation where we'd envisioned our client having individual events. This is what we talked about during discovery. The client, turns out, is in the meantime envisioning, oh my gosh, all of my weekly movie schedules can be on this calendar. Massive recurring events, and in fact, only recurring events. They don't have a single one-off event in their calendar. So we had to retool our calendars to support recurring events. This was a big deal because you can't switch from one to the other once migration starts. So we had to halt migration, wait for that fix, and then continue on. And in the meantime, there were all these crazy issues with display because it does not manage itself well in non-calendar display format if you're having list format for recurring events. So massive red flag. Make sure that you have discussions about anything like events that might recur or any other features that you can't. You really have to choose that path early on before going down the development path. And define your roles early so that you don't have overwrites and deletions as people are adding permissions to features on local machines. Finally, content governance tools. So once your users can actually edit the site, there is the question of what they should be editing. And I think actually there's a panel tomorrow afternoon, if anyone's wanting to follow on in this, that looks like they maybe address this particular section in more detail. But there are some workbench tools, a good suite of tools that promote workflow, editing states, and help you to figure out how to edit and work with pending content. The expiration dates are critical. This is a little bit of a practice, a physical practice. You have to get folks to work on the act of expiring content. So this means defining content governance and adding the practice of expiration for certain content types and reasonable periods. But if you can actually surface this, what has expired, into that panel, then people can go revisit and refresh that content and get it live again if that's appropriate. We dream and talk about creating something beautiful that's going to manage all of this for everybody as a Drupal plugin. So there's a chance that'll happen. I can't promise it because Will likes to sleep. So if you're interested in maybe kind of seeing if something comes to that, we do have a blog at figleaf.com that we invite you to watch. And now we're looking at QA. You can photograph our contact info, and this will also be on the site in the slide deck upload area. You can reach out to us directly for questions, and also I invite questions now. I'll put Will back up here so you can see Will answering. There's Will.
Well, it's not a question, but just to ask you what you were saying about the accessibility earlier. When you're in D8, a lot of those features are already built in.
Yes.
For example, the tags or whatever. And though I've only played with it a little bit in my local environment, CK Editor has an accessibility plugin to content editors to help them flag their own stuff, so that way you don't have to make it as.
Yeah. There are a lot of custom pieces that come with things like CK Editor that you can turn on that sometimes work well for people, that sometimes really kind of irritate them. So it's a fine balance getting people to do what they should do for accessibility.
What have you found is a happy balance point?
Will, have you got some advice here? Because I feel like most of the time, even when you put in that required alt field, people are putting image or something entirely unhelpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of my personal sandboxes to get content editors to pay attention to this one.
Yeah. Uh-oh, we can't hear you well. Oh no.
Hold on, sorry. As far as like real-time grammar analysis, probably not going to work. As far as I think example texts are amazing. Whether you're providing, when you provide your instructions, when you provide your tips, being consistent, like having an example of an entire piece of content that's consistent across your fields. So you're saying, this is your title of your photo, this is your alt, you're presenting descriptions of the same photo so that across your content, so that people have a sense of consistency and know what they're supposed to be writing. It's kind of about as far as you could go. I don't think you could stick a grammar analysis into a jQuery thing effectively, but it's a neat idea.
I think part of the problem always with accessibility is anybody who's not seen the reason you have to pay attention to it doesn't get it. So if you have the opportunity and you have an internal team and you can show them a video of somebody trying to use a screen reader to see your site or any site, it's huge. We did some work with the AFB. I mean, I did some work with the AFB about 20 years ago, and that changed my life. I don't think twice about it. You need to have a real reason for a table, and you need to say what's going on, and you need to have your headers, because otherwise it's not useful at all, and it can be critical content, especially in our sphere.
I'm a content strategist, and so we're very interested. I've spent many years being one of the users of systems. And I do think that some of this has to really be put on the content authors and editors themselves. They should know. And so there is a balance. I do not think you raised a lot of really good tips, and I'm going to take them back to my desk and say, look, we need to make this go compliant. But on the other hand, the content authors and editors, there have to be some business process rules in place, and they need to know that coming in before we begin to use the system. So it can't be just the developers trying to completely constrain a system so a content author can't ever.
I agree. I don't think we will ever be in a situation where you can fully predict everything, but to the degree that we can take that load off of people, because
There's a happy balance.
we know that we'd like everybody using our system to have been trained and not scared of it and know how it works. But the fact is, they're going to put an intern in place to enter 90% of their content with no training, right? And they've never, if they've done HTML, it was for their personal website. So, it's unfortunately not realistic that most of our environments where our content and our systems go are as organized as we'd like them to be. So that's why providing as much support as we can in this way is important, I think. Well, I want to make sure you guys will have time to get coffee because there's so little of it. And we get to your next sessions, but please do feel free to reach out to Will and I. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Will. Talk to you later.
Question for you. Is there a general rule